News Desserts of the Week. Here is your host, Jim Santel.
Good morning. This is Jim Santel, and this is Morning Cannolis. It is our weekly review, our analysis, our examination, our talking with you about these major stories in our lives, statewide, nationally, and sometimes throughout the world, every single Saturday morning here on the broadcast stations of Civic Media, talking about those areas of government, law, and the aspiration for justice in America and worldwide that animate our lives. Thank you so much for being with me this morning for this hour and hopefully the second hour too on our Saturday morning broadcast. It is Saturday, March 16th, 2024. This is our 89th broadcast on these Civic Media stations, statewide and in other places throughout our country as well. I'm going to be talking about that at the end of the second hour. We've got a very special programming note coming up about the future of this broadcast. We're not going away. We're going to be restyling and recrafting somewhat to ensure that our goals, that is, in the areas of government law and aspiration of justice, are further met and further advanced as a result of our discussions here every Saturday morning. As always, we are encouraging this morning your questions, your inquiries about the subject matters on our syllabus for this day. That number is always 844-967-2789. Once again, that's 844-967-2789. My excellent producer, Johnny, and I are here in the studios of WAUK in Waukesha to take those calls, those inquiries of yours, and to get you on the air talking with me about those significant things in our lives. As always, this morning we have an ambitious, very ambitious, but nonetheless achievable agenda. I'm going to talk with you in just a moment or so about what that syllabus is all about. We ask three simple questions. What happened? Why are those things relevant? And what options do we have in response to them? What is on our agenda for this morning? Lots of things happening in the areas of government and rule of law and justice just in the past 24 hours, 48 hours, certainly throughout this past week. It has been a big news week when it comes to these important issues of government operation and law in America. We're going to be doing some geography, going right down the East Coast in this, our first hour, and probably a bit into our second hour as well. We're going to talk about cases in New York, then also in Georgia, and then also in Florida. And you know what those are. You know about the status of the state case, the so-called hush money case, pending right now in a Manhattan criminal courtroom. I'm going to talk about what happened just yesterday and why it's going to certainly prompt a change in the scheduling of the trial in that matter. I'm going to go south into Georgia. Two major events on Thursday and Friday of just this past week, one of them involving some of the dismissal of charges in that omnibus RICO indictment against Donald Trump and others, and then almost as significant, the decision by the judge there not to disqualify the prosecutor, but to require that her deputy, the fellow who is principally in charge of prosecuting the case, that he no longer be a part of that. We're going to talk about what the judge said. We're going to do some microscopic justice once again, going deep into the specifics of what the judge in that case said and did, the reasons for his decision, and in all three of these areas, including the Mar-a-Lago case, we'll be doing some analysis about where these cases come from, what the decisions mean, and what we can anticipate for the future. Again, in New York, and in Georgia and in Florida. All those cases, three of the four major criminal cases pending against the former president, a present candidate for the presidency. His name, of course, is Donald Trump. And then into our second hour, we're going to go back to, as we often do, the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, which issued two, although related, decisions yesterday in the area of social media. We have talked about this a lot in the past, that one of the major focuses of our United States Supreme Court in this 2023-2024 term has been on social media and the interaction between it and you and government. Two major cases, basically the same opinion authored by Amy Coney Barrett, released just yesterday, having to do with this connection between government officials and the media, social media in particular, things that are out there posted on social media. We'll talk about that And then, as I said, at the end of the second hour, a significant programming note about what you're going to be hearing going forward on our 90th broadcast beginning next Saturday. We'll tell you more about that at the end of our second hour this morning on our broadcast. Thank you once again for joining Johnny and me for our discussion, and let us launch right into that ambitious agenda this morning by beginning in Manhattan. Big news coming out just yesterday, March 15th. A New York judge, his name is Juan Merchant, who is presiding over the so-called catch and kill or hush money case. This is the case involving criminal charges against Donald Trump, alleging that right before the 2016 election, he basically violated New York law in failing to properly account for, describe transactions, financial transactions operated through his fixer, Michael Cohen, by which he paid off a porn star named Stormy Daniels and caught that case, killed it through the National Enquirer, a fellow named David Pecker, and prevented us, at least for that time, from hearing all about that. The allegation is less about the salacious nature of that relationship, but rather a violation of New York state law. And as we said last week, when we talked a lot about the categories of things that Alvin Bragg, who is the district attorney there, he's the prosecutor in that case, the things he's going to be presenting, yes, he's going to talk about that financial transaction, but he's also going to talk about the setting in which it happens and describe these other things that also happen with a second woman also being paid off, a doorman being paid off, the Access Hollywood tape, all those kinds of things that were happening at the same time, telling this overall story, what I have described as Donald Trump's origin story when it comes to attempts to undermine, to affect the election in America. He is going to describe the fact that this case, like the others, most of the others, is at least at a minimum, also about election interference. Why? Because the allegations go to that fundamental theme that Alvin Bragg is going to be presenting during the course of the trial, that Donald Trump, by doing this, by paying people off, by violating thereby New York law, he effectively prevented us from understanding fully who he is, what he is as a candidate, and therefore attempted to interfere with the election, the campaign at that time. What happened? What happened just yesterday? Well, in order to understand what happened yesterday in the context of that prosecution, we need to go back and understand that the judge, Juan Merchant, who is the trial judge who's presiding over this proceeding in his courtroom, has scheduled this case to go ahead. Jury selection beginning on March 25th. That's right. That's 9 days from today, the end of this month. Judge Merchant had indicated that he is going to begin jury selection on that day, a date that's been on his calendar for a long time. And now with all of the other trials, as we've talked about previously, all of them highly unlikely going to be going ahead at any time in the near future. Doubtful they will even see the light of day in this calendar year. Juan Merchant said, let's go ahead and try this case. And indeed, Alvin Bragg said, yes, ready to go. And the plan was to do just that until maybe not full stop, but a considerable stop happened just yesterday. Again, we need to go back to understand how it is that this happened. During the course of any criminal case, including in the state of New York, in this Manhattan courtroom, there is a statutory, a legal, a constitutional obligation for prosecutors to present to the defense all of the information that has been gathered during the course of the investigation, to ensure that the defendant has a full and complete opportunity to review all the things the government is going to be presenting during the course of the trial. That includes witness statements, that includes reports of interviews, that includes forensics evidence, photographs, other things that might be used during the course of the prosecution, even things that may not see the light of day. All of that is required in the federal system. We've got statutory authority for that. There are cases called Jenks and Brady that also impose upon federal prosecutors the obligation, the rightful, the constitutional obligation to produce information, to produce that information so that a defendant, in this case Donald Trump, can properly defend himself against the charges brought against him. That is a fundamental concept. It is what animates our system. It's what I lived by and embraced for 30 years of my practice doing criminal work in the federal district court in the Eastern District of Wisconsin. It makes sense, and it is a part of our fundamental system of the rule of law. And so what happens here? As a result of the prosecution, the announcement of the charges, which I just described involving this hush money case brought by the district attorney, the district attorney promptly turns over all the information that he and his staff, investigators, have gathered about this particular charge, supporting and also arguably exculpating the defendant for conduct in which he is allegedly involved. That's a part of the process. And as a part of that, in June of last year, Alvin Bragg reached out where? To the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, reached down Manhattan, if you will, and reached into a federal room, the room of the U.S. Attorney there, and said, I know that in the past, 2008, you investigated a case involving the same set of facts. And during the course of that, not only did you prosecute and ultimately convict this fellow named Michael Cohen, but you also did other things that pursued these allegations that there was a federal violation based upon the same fundamental facts. And Alvin Bragg appropriately said, I want those materials. I want you to give those to me so that I can produce those to the defendant in my state case. That's proper to do, and that's what he did. And the U.S. Attorney's Office back in the summer of last year produced some, heavy emphasis on some of those documents, came back and said, here's what we've got. And Alvin Bragg repeatedly, in that connection, did turn over the documents that were produced to him by the U.S. Attorney's Office, had done that previously, did it again now. And then in January of this year, the defense, on behalf of Donald Trump, filed its own, submitted its own, served its own subpoena upon the U.S. Attorney's Office for the same kinds of things, presumably. Now, we don't know exactly what those requests and what the subpoena looked like, but when we come back, we're going to talk more about what happened in the wake of the defense subpoena of the U.S. Attorney's Office and how that affected the scheduling of the trial. Right after this break, discussion following about the status of that criminal case in Manhattan. We are back talking this morning in these first segments of our first hour on our Saturday morning broadcast, all about the status of this case that was scheduled to go to trial a week from Monday in a Manhattan criminal courtroom, a state criminal courtroom, and the decision by the judge necessitated by events to postpone that proceeding. Let's talk more about what prompted that decision by Juan Merchan, the judge who's presiding over that case. Right before the break, telling you about the process by which a defendant is constitutionally, statutorily entitled to get documents as a part of the prosecution and the defense of the case. Again, a defendant not required under the law to produce anything to defend himself or herself, itself, under our Constitution, presumed innocent until proven guilty, not obliged to do anything. But yes, indeed, the prosecution not only has the burden of proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury unanimously, but also to produce materials, information, so that the defendant has a complete sense of what is going on in the case, what he or she or it is going to hear during the course of the trial. And again, Alvin Bragg did that in connection with his own investigative materials, made a request to the U.S. Attorney's Office, also there in Manhattan, and asked them for all the materials that they had in connection with their own discrete investigation back in 2008 of the same events. And that corpus of material also relevant because, of course, inside that federal investigation was a lot of information about an individual named Michael Cohen, who was ultimately convicted for that and other things. in the federal court. And he, of course, is a major witness in this state case now on the state docket of Judge Juan Merchan. And so the information relevant, and Alvin Bragg gets the initial tranche of materials, turns those over to the defendant. And again, in January of just this year, the defense files and submits to the U.S. Attorney's Office what could arguably be called a follow-up and maybe even somewhat duplicative request. We haven't seen the specific language of their subpoena, but they asked for the same set of materials. And lo and behold, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan comes forward and produces about 100,000 pages of records. And that coming out, of course, in the last couple of weeks or so, more materials apparently coming down the road, 100,000 documents, presumably not previously seen by Alvin Bragg, not previously produced through this system, which I previously described right now. And as a result of that, appropriately, the defendant says, wait a minute, we are ready to go to trial in 9 days. I'm just getting now 100,000 documents that I've not previously seen. How can I prepare my defense? And in this particular case, when a defendant comes forward and says, I do not have sufficient time, given the timing of the clock and the movement forward on this trial, Donald Trump's lawyers are right. Donald Trump's lawyers are right to say we need more time to look at all of this information. Now, as a practical matter, do we live in a time when all of these materials are produced in banker's boxes the old way when I first started as a prosecutor producing them? The answer is no. It's all done electronically. And yes, indeed, there are systems in place for ensuring that defendants and prosecutors and other people involved in the case on both sides can do word searches, can do analysis of documents. It is no longer the case that as a lawyer, as a prosecutor, defense attorney, I need to sit down and go through each one of those banker's boxes in great detail and identify every single document, read every single document. But I do want to find out what is there. And so, again, electronics will help me a whole lot in doing that, word searches, those kinds of things. But there may be some documents. And indeed, Alvin Bragg has confirmed that among those 100,000 documents, there's a subset that is fairly relevant to this, focusing again upon Michael Cohen. And certainly if you're if you're defense attorneys in these cases responding to what the prosecution has provided to you, you want to read those documents yourself and don't want to rely upon an electronic system just to tell you what they say. It is important as a part of your defense. And so what happens in this particular case, these materials coming in, 73,000 pages of records initially, 31,000 additional documents also dropped as a result of this, some subset of those apparently highly relevant to this case. As a result of this, Donald Trump's lawyers say, Judge, we can't go ahead in 9 days, 10 days from now. We've got to review all these materials as a part of our defensive preparation to ensure that there is, in fact, a defense to be made. If there are some things in this material, this tranche material that we need to take a look at, we need to prepare for that. And indeed, they're right about that. And what happens, of course, is they file then a motion for an extension, a delay in the trial. They're seeking 90 days, 3 months, which again, depending upon what those 100,000 documents say, may or may not be unreasonable. Alvin Bragg has come back and said, well, not all of them are relevant. How about 30 days? 30 days is what he's proposing. And oh, by the way, the Trump attorneys are also saying, Judge, you need to dismiss this case. Why? Because of these pretrial antics, as they describe them, of the government, the failure of between the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Alvin Bragg DA's office to produce these documents. All of that renders it impossible for us to defend against this case. Also claiming that for that reason, the case should be dismissed outright. Outright dismissal, which could be one of the remedies on Judge Merchan's agenda, although highly likely. What has he done? Well, he has said that I'm going to delay the case right now for 30 days beyond March 25th. And so we know it's not starting on March 25th. What we do know, however, that on that morning, on Monday morning, March 25th, he's going to call everybody in, and he is going to say to them, what is going on here? I had this scheduled. We're all ready to go, and now we're getting additional documents this late in the process. This case has been charged for a year. and discovery should have been undertaken and pursued and exchanged long before now. What is going on here? He has asked them to provide a detailed timeline of the events leading up to this recent disclosure, tell us what happened exactly during the course of this process. And he has also said that he will set a new trial date if necessary after the hearing. He said he wants this detailed timeline and also sought the correspondence with federal prosecutors who recently turned over these records, including letters and subpoenas and emails and notes and messages. He's trying to get to the bottom of what happened to derail this trial. He is not happy, plainly, and I suspect we're going to be hearing about this from the judge on March 25th. Alvin Bragg has got to be upset about this as well because his federal counterparts, again, federal prosecutors, not state prosecutors, now disclosing weeks, days before the trial, all this information. We don't know if Alvin Bragg had it before, presumably not, or he would have disclosed it. But that is the circumstance that brings us to this situation where the trial long anticipated, the one trial that might have gone ahead this calendar year, now suspended again and likely going to be suspended for at least 30 days, if not longer. Again, my own assessment is that 90 days may not be an inappropriate amount of time, given what has happened here. 100,000 documents, as I said before, probably not all of them relevant, but relevant to a defense, you bet it is. Why? Because a lot of that has to do with Michael Cohen. Who is Michael Cohen? He is going to testify predominantly during the course of this trial about the very transactions that allegedly resulted in this violation of New York law. For that reason, all of this relevant as we now look to March 25th and down the road for the rescheduling of this trial pending in the Manhattan court. When we come back, we're going to go south. We're going to go south to Georgia, spend a lot of time talking about other developments of just this past week in the parallel but different criminal investigation going on there. All about the status of cases involving current presidential candidate Donald Trump, former president of the United States of America. And in our first segments, talking about what happened in Manhattan just this past week as a result of the late disclosure of a tranche of documents, 100,000 documents coming out of the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. That's the district that previously, under the prior administration, had investigated the same fact scenario that is now the subject of a state prosecution pending there in the Manhattan District Court in front of Judge Juan Merchan. And the takeaway from this is a lot of explaining to do. The district attorney himself, obviously concerned about this, had said, in an abundance of caution, appropriate to have some delay accomplished to ensure the defense has an opportunity to review these materials. The defense, of course, saying, no, we need 90 days, not just 30 days. And indeed, because of the misbehavior, the misconduct, as they allege it, by the prosecution, the failure to produce these documents in a more timely fashion, because of that, the entire case should be dismissed. Now, unlikely that Juan Merchan is going to do that on March 25th, but he is going to ask some piercing questions about exactly what happened, and indeed he should. There is some responsibility here on the side of the DA for getting this material. There's a huge amount of responsibility here. And beyond that, there is some explaining that needs to be done coming out of my own former agency, the U.S. Department of Justice. Why are these materials being produced now for the first time when we've known about the pendency of the prosecution for well over a year? What happened? And inside the Department of Justice, Merrick Garland also has some explaining to do, as does the U.S. Attorney there, for why the delay happened. Why is it that just upon a subpoena from the defense, which they can do, why now are these materials being produced for the first time? It is a cause of great concern, not only for the scheduling of the trial, which again is going to be pushed back, arguably months. And as I've said before, every time a trial is delayed, other things can happen. And so today, where there's no certainty about exactly when this trial is going to be conducted, when jury selection will begin, all kinds of things can happen between the time of a prosecution initiation and the course of discovery, even the setting of a trial date. witnesses change, positions changed, counsel changes, all kinds of things, facts and circumstances can develop and be disclosed that will prompt a further delay. We don't know what's happening in the future, but this is an example of the kinds of things that can, in fact, do happen, not without explanation, which is what Judge Mershad is going to ask, but they happen, and they result in delays in the prosecution and the defense of cases like this. We will plainly be very attentive here on all the broadcast stations of Civic Media to this trial and others not happening 9 days from now. Let's go south, and let's look to Georgia. We also know there, this omnibus, this huge sweeping RICO case, 41 counts, 19 co-defendants initially, huge sweeping indictment returned by an indicting grand jury there, again, a long time ago. Now, like in New York, in the course of pretrial motions. What is that all about? It means that following the return of the indictment, two major things happen. One is the defense has an opportunity to file motions with the judge, as does the prosecution, ask for various things in connection with the anticipated trial. Motions to suppress, motions to keep evidence out, motions to bring evidence in, all sorts of things related to the validity of the indictment itself, the charges, all sorts of things related to witnesses and forensics evidence, and all kinds of things can happen. All of that written out for the judge, often oral argument in front of judges in this pretrial period to narrow and sift and ensure that when the trial begins, it is focused upon things that are relevant and material. That's what the process is all about in every single one of these cases, including the Manhattan case, and certainly including the omnibus Georgia case brought by Fani Willis, who again is the Fulton County District Attorney, returned by a grand jury, an investigative grand jury, and then indicting grand jury, this sweeping RICO charge against Donald Trump and many others. And so what has happened recently? Well, we're going to talk at great length this morning, a microscopic justice analysis of what the judge did with respect to this continuing and pending until just yesterday challenge to Fani Willis's continued role as the prosecutor. We're going to get to that in just a moment or so. Even before Scott McAfee, who is the judge in that case, he is the state court judge, who is presiding over that criminal case in Fulton County. Even before that, the day before, the judge quashes 6 charges in that omnibus indictment. Surprising that he did this, but perhaps understandable as you look once again at the decision, the written decision that he issues this decision to dismiss, Scott McAfee does, 6 of the 41 counts against the 19 co-defendants. 4 of them already have pled guilty, as we have talked before, since this grand jury indictment was returned in August. The charge, the fundamental RICO charge remains. That's a racketeering charge brought against all the defendants. And the judge is very clear in his order that those charged based upon overt acts in furtherance of this RICO criminal engagement, that the indictment says the defendants engaged in furtherance of this racketeering conspiracy, the RICO allegations and the overt acts described in the indictment, all of those remain. None of that affected by his decision on Thursday to dismiss 6 other counts. The judge, Scott McAfee, explicit in stating that his order does not apply to those acts, nor does it relate to this qualification issue, which we're going to get to. The 9-page ruling that Judge McAfee does issue in the middle of this week, however, takes aim at charges asserting this, that Donald Trump and other defendants solicited public officials to break the law by violating their oaths of office. That's what's set forth in the indictment. That's the theory upon which these particular counts proceeded. For example, one of those counts against Donald Trump said that he unlawfully solicited, requested, and importuned the Georgia Secretary of State, you know his name well, it's Brad Raffensperger, to violate his oath of office by decertifying the election. That's what one of those counts said. And the judge comes back and says, as to that count and others, which we'll describe in particularity in just a moment, he says these 6 counts contain all the essential elements of the crime, but fail to allege in sufficient detail regarding the nature of their commission, the kinds of things the defendant is entitled to know about, again, as a part of our process. Due process, you're entitled to discovery, the information the government is going to present against you during the course of the trial. And you're also entitled to know with detail the specific allegations against you in the indictment. The Judge McAfee, writes this. He said, these counts, do not give the defendants enough information to prepare their defenses intelligently, as the defendants could have violated the Constitution and thus the statute in dozens, if not hundreds, of distinct ways. That's the judge writing in his 9-page opinion of just this past week. One of those 6 charges, once again, count 28, related to Trump's telephone call. You recognize that already from the description that I read from the indictment. Raffensperger is called by then still President Trump on January 2nd, pressuring the Secretary of State to find enough votes to overturn the presidential election results in that state. Another charge, count 38, also now dismissed from this indictment, relates to a letter that Trump sent to Raffensperger in September of 2021, asking him to decertify the Georgia presidential election results or seek similar legal remedies and announce the true winner. That's the basis of count 38. Other counts quashed by the judge also related to these attempts to pressure public officials. 3 counts, those are numbered 2 and 6 and 23 in the indictment, allege that several of these defendants broke the law when they urged Georgia lawmakers to appoint pro-Trump electors after Joe Biden, our current president, actually won the state. Count 5 concerned a call that Trump made to a fellow named David Ralston, Ralston, who was then the Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives. During that conversation, according to the allegations in the indictment, this count now dismissed, Trump pressed Mr. Ralston to call a special legislative session to appoint new electors. Again, all a part of this theory that's based upon that the defendants soliciting public officials to violate their oath. The judge saying, yeah, you've got the count described and you've got the elements there, but you're not giving specific, sufficient, detailed information upon which the defendant can rely in defending against the case as we go to trial. And so he dismisses those 6 counts. Now, as I said before, does it accomplish a huge blow? Well, the answer is probably not. Probably not, but it certainly does take away some of the force of this omnibus 41-count indictment, and that leads to the remedies that may be out there. Fani Willis has 3 choices. Fani Willis has 3 choices here. She can do nothing. She can simply let that stand and not appeal this at all and go to trial without those 6 counts. Arguably, she's going to tell the same kind of story as those counts described in sort of the speaking indictment, the speaking charges already in those 6 counts, no longer a part of the prosecution against Donald Trump and the others. She can do nothing and simply go ahead with the case as it has been reduced by Scott McAfee, or she can appeal. She can pursue this to an appellate court and say, you know what, the judge was wrong. And in fact, the counts do, in fact, provide enough information for the defendant to know what it is that he and the others are charged with, and seek to overturn Scott McAfee's opinion. Or third, and probably most likely, she can go back to the grand jury. She can go back to the grand jury and say, well, it appears that the judge did not like the language of the indictment as it was returned by the grand jury. We're going to restyle these counts. We're going to add that detail that was not in the first indictment. We're going to ask the grand jury to re-indict on these cases, called a superseding indictment, a follow-up indictment that corrects the problems that the district court judge, the trial judge, identified in his order. That's also a remedy that she has out there, probably one of those that she is considering at the top of her list right now. At some point soon, she will need to identify which one of those 3 remedies she is going to pursue. Now, that also underscores, again, the grand jury process and how this works. As I've often said on this broadcast, grand juries do in fact review the evidence, the testimony, the documents, all the other evidence before them to determine whether there's probable cause. And yes, it is in the end a decision by the grand jury to issue charges. But as a practical matter, as we have also discussed, it is the obligation of the prosecutor, in this case, Fani Willis. When I was a prosecutor for 30 years as an assistant U.S. attorney with the imprimatur of the U.S. attorney, to draft what it is the grand jury has found or is finding during the course of their investigation and present the draft of that to the grand jury to embrace or reject As I said before, there have been times in my career when a grand jury has gotten back to me and said, you know what, we do not concur, Mr. Santel. We're not going to go ahead with these particular counts. That's their role, but it is the role of the prosecutor. And this is the key here. In this case, Fani Willis to come forward and say, we've got to remedy the problem with these 6 counts. And so, grand jury, we're not asking you to make a different determination on probable cause, but we are going to present to you some new language as to these 6 counts, asking you to supersede, to find probable cause as these offense conduct pieces are now redescribed in the corrective or superseding grand jury. She can do that. Can go back to the grand jury. That's probably what she will do, especially since, unlike the Manhattan case that we described earlier in this broadcast, there is no trial date right now. I know she has talked about wanting to go ahead in August, and the defense plainly has poo-pooed that notion, said, no, this has got to be tried well into 2025. But she's got the opportunity now to go back and remedy that problem. And it's highly likely, again, she'll go back to the grand jury and do just that. But it is undeniably a reflection of the crafting, the drafting that was done on behalf of the grand jury the first time around in this very extensive grand jury indictment. And now Fani Willis, if she wants to pursue this, needs to go back and correct the errors that her office did on behalf of the grand jury in drafting that initial omnibus indictment the first time around. We'll see what she does, and we'll see what she does when it comes to the future prosecution of this case. We know as well, the other major story coming out just yesterday, that Fani Willis remains on this case. And when we come back, we're going to go deep into the decision, also by Scott McAfee, to keep her on that case in exchange for the principal, the lead prosecutor, his name is Nathan Wade, to resign from that prosecution. All that happened yesterday. We're going to talk about it next.
Show.
Talking now in this, the final segment of our first hour, getting into depth on the other significant thing that came out of Fulton County just yesterday. This decision, again, by Scott McAfee. Yes, he's the same judge who dismissed those 6 counts from the indictment, leaving Fani Willis with some decision-making to do about what she does next with respect to those counts. The other major thing that Scott McAfee did yesterday is release his omnibus order. We're going to spend some time going through it. A 23-page order finding that there is not a basis for Fani Willis or her office to be disqualified from the future prosecution of this case, thus enabling her to make decisions not only about those 6 counts, but other things in the future prosecution, the pretrial motions still pending there. But in exchange for that, finding that the principal prosecutor, Special Assistant District Attorney Nathan Wade, hired by Fani Willis during the course of this proceeding, and with whom she had a personal romantic relationship, that he needs to go. And indeed, in the wake of the judge's order of just yesterday, Nathan Wade, the other big news, resigned from that Trump case after the judge's ruling, finding, again, no basis upon which to disqualify the officer, Fani Willis, but finding an appearance of impropriety. And we're going to get to that, the basis for the decision by Nathan Wade to leave and no longer being part of this, ensuring, if you will, that Fani Willis, at least for now, has the capacity to go ahead and prosecute the case, but without him. And so what is the basis for this? Again, we're going to spend some time at the last minutes of this segment, and then going into our second hour, some deep dive, some microscopic justice analysis of exactly what it is the judge said and what he didn't say about this all-encompassing decision. This challenge is brought by a defendant named Michael Roman, R-O-M-A-N. He's one of the defendants in this case. He's joined by 8 other co-defendants who also joined in this motion to disqualify the Fulton County DA's office and the DA in particular on various grounds, and specifically alleging the DA and Wade traveled together on multiple occasions and had other relationships, associated expenses during the course of their not only relationship, but also the time that they were prosecuting this case together. The claims presented, as the judge said, a possible financial conflict of interest for the district attorney. And in the end, as you're going to see as we go through this analysis, he finds that there is not actually, as we have said on this broadcast and others, there actually is not a conflict of interest presented by the defense. The defense motion presented by Roman and the other defendants in this case. What he does say in a second major portion of his order is that there is indeed an appearance of impropriety that necessitates that something be done here. And I would offer the perspective on this, which is that the judge is effectively cleaning up the personnel matters, the admittedly embarrassing, the admittedly probably inappropriate and improper inside the office relationship that should never have gone forward. We'll talk about some of the language that he uses to describe that relationship. What he doesn't say appropriately is that relationship inside the office, as difficult and challenging as it was and problematic as it is, does not affect the prosecution outside of the office with respect to Donald Trump, doesn't deprive them of any constitutional or statutory rights. And for that reason, no conflict of interest, nothing to support the disqualification of the prosecutor herself, if indeed this principal who prosecutes on her behalf, on behalf of the office, Nathan Wade, if he is no longer a part of this. Fascinating opinion, which we're going to get into as we do just that. A lot of preliminary information set forth again by the judge in his omnibus order, which is readable. It is digestible, and I encourage you to take a look at it if you haven't done already just that. He describes the 2.5 days of testimony. Many, if not all of you, remember that well, including testimony of various individuals, including Nathan Wade, including, stunningly, the DA herself takes the stand and describes things related to the relationship and her own conduct. And the court, as it says on this very second page, after having given all the parties exactly what the judge promised, a full opportunity to disclose what they want to disclose, a full opportunity, evidentiary-wise, to argue the case as well, the court finds that the defendants failed, that is the defense, this Mr. Roman and others, failed to meet their burden of proving that the DA acquired an actual conflict of interest, in this case, through her personal relationship and recurring travels with her lead prosecutor, Nathan Wade, the financial issues there as well. All the other grounds for disqualification, including forensic misconduct, which we'll also get to, are also denied. He said there's simply no basis for doing any of this. And then goes on to say this on page 2. The established record now highlights, however, a significant appearance of impropriety, distinguishes that from the legal standard of actual conflict of interest, even forensic misconduct, which he also describes troublingly later in the opinion. He says that the significant appearance of impropriety infects the current structure of the prosecution team, exactly what I'm describing before, this internal issue, the internal structure, the structure of the prosecution team, an appearance that must be removed through the state's selection of one of two options, either to get rid of Mr. Wade, he's got to go, or Fani Willis and the DA's office have got to be disqualified. The defense motions, he said, are therefore granted in part, and then proceeds to describe the conflict of interest law in the state of Georgia. And in particular, says that highest courts consistently remind us that prosecutors are indeed held to a unique and exacting professional standard in light of their public responsibility and their power. Got it just right. Prosecutors have this tremendous amount of authority and power and need to wield it on behalf of the people they represent with integrity, with a focus on justice, the rule of law. That's what really animates Alvin Bragg in that Manhattan case to say, you know what? I've got a responsibility to ensure that justice is done here. And yes, indeed, Donald Trump, in that case, is entitled to some additional time to review this document tranche that's just recently released. And again, the judge here, Scott McAfee, in this unrelated, arguably related around the edges case, reminds prosecutors of this high burden that they have when it comes to dealing with and prosecuting cases, and then goes on to say, provides the framework for his decision. He said, the Georgia law says there are two bases upon which to disqualify. Those are conflicts of interest and forensic misconduct. Those are the two generally recognized grounds for disqualification. He cites the law and the authority for that, and that gives rise to the cases that he describes and his resolution, ultimately, of this situation, establishing no disqualification, but an awful lot of criticism of the DA there in Fulton County. Right after the top of the hour break, we're going to get into that in greater detail, reciting what the judge said and giving you some opinions, some perspectives on what's going on in Georgia right after this break.
Welcome. Grab your favorite morning beverage and join us for Morning Cannolis with Jim Santel.
You don't know me, but I'm your brother.
Sampling the news desserts of the week, here is your host, Jim Santel.
Good morning and welcome back to this, our second hour here on this Saturday morning, March 16th, 2024. Delighted to have you with me and with my wonderful producer, Johnny, here on the broadcast stations of Civic Media. As always, taking your phone calls at 844-967-2789. I'm going to get to some of those phone calls later in this, our second hour of our morning broadcast. As always, reviewing, surveying, analyzing, summarizing those major events and stories in the areas of government and law and the aspiration for justice in America. We spent most of our first hour talking about what's going on in Manhattan, the certainty that the so-called hush money case there is not going to be going to trial as we anticipated in about 9 days from now. That is a significant change based upon the late production of evidence and of discovery in that matter. Lots of explaining to do before the judge coming up on the 25th of March. We went now to Georgia, where again, in that case also some significant developments that affect the future of that prosecution as well. We talked at great length about the dismissal by Judge Scott McAfee of 6 of the charges, 6 of the solicitation charges, if you will, based upon his determination that they were not specifically particularized to let the defendant know what it is that they were charged with. Fani Willis has some options to pursue on that. And now talking about this major decision that dropped just yesterday, in which Scott McAfee, again, in a related but different set of facts and circumstances, find that indeed the defense motion to disqualify her based upon this personal relationship, financial transactions between her and her principal prosecutor in this case, his name is Nathan Wade, that does not provide a sufficient basis in which to disqualify her and therefore denies the defense motion, but says that one of two things have to happen. Either if she is not disqualified, he has got to go, or she needs to leave the case, as presumably the Fulton County DA's office generally would. She plainly chooses yesterday afternoon to stay on the case, keep her office there, and Nathan Wade resigns, the special ADA that she hired, with whom she had a personal relationship. Again, the focus of this order, finding as a matter of law and fact, no conflict of interest specifically to warrant disqualification, but an awful lot to suggest that what was going on inside the office, this personal relationship, which again did not have an impact upon the prosecution, nonetheless gives people pause and prompts people to think about the quality, the integrity of the prosecution itself. And so Judge McAfee, in his 23-page order, describes all of that, setting forth the standards, the facts and circumstances, a lot of information about what happened in the course of the 2.5-day hearing, the evidentiary hearing, and finds in the end that a special assistant DA's oath of office, he's talking about Nathan Wade here, in combination with supervision theoretically, and this is important, theoretically provided by a neutral and detached district attorney, somebody who can supervise him, with whom he does not have a relationship, should generally be sufficient to dispel the appearance of improper incentive, okay? Nor would a romantic relationship, he says, between prosecutors standing alone typically implicate disqualification, assuming neither prosecutor had the ability to pay the other as long as the relationship persisted. But in combination, he says, which is what we got here, alleged by the defendants, there's a prima facie case, a case that on its face may indicate there's something to look at here, It raises issues about financial enrichment and improper motivations, which inevitably and unsurprisingly invites emotions such as this. So he says, you know what, I'm going to find that there's no disqualification basis, but an awful lot of fire here, producing smoke also, and prompting me to look more deeply into all of this. Describes in great detail some of the testimony about the relationship between the DA and Reid, traveling together on 4 occasions that resulted in some of the documented expenses that were part of this very, very extensive testimonial evidentiary hearing. He said such a reimbursement practice where the money is exchanged between the two of them may be unusual, and the lack of any documentary corroboration understandably concerning, yet the testimony withstood direct contradiction, he says. It was corroborated by other evidence and was not so incredible as to be inherently unbelievable. However, he says, as the DA herself acknowledged, no ledger exists, and other than a best guesstimate, there is no way to be certain that expenses were split completely evenly. Again, he's focusing upon, at the invitation of the defense, to look more closely at the nature of this relationship inside the office, not in the courtroom, not in the public domain, having to do with finances and the relationship. In the end, he says this: the court finds, based largely on the district attorney's testimony, that the evidence demonstrated that the financial gain flowing from her relationship with Wade was not a motivating factor on the part of the district attorney to indict and prosecute the case. That's key. That's fundamental, right? The relationship exists, but it wasn't a motivating factor. While a general motive, he goes on to say, for more income can never be disregarded entirely. The financial issue means something, is what he's saying. The district attorney was not financially destitute throughout this time or in any great need, as she testified that her salary exceeds $200,000 per year without any indication of excessive expenses or debts. In other words, she wasn't doing this for the money. No indication that the evidence shows that at all. Similarly, the court finds that the defendants have failed to demonstrate that the DA's conduct has impacted, and this is key also, has impacted or influenced the case to the defendant's detriment. In other words, this is going on. It's not good. It should have been taken care of, shouldn't have happened, but no detriment, no impact upon the defendants themselves, nothing having to do with the actual prosecution of this case. While prejudice is not a required element for disqualification, he says, it is relevant to consideration of due process and the defendant's requested remedy of complete dismissal. And he opens up that door then. What's going to happen here? Is this an appropriate basis upon which to dismiss the case entirely? He goes on to say, defendants argue the financial arrangement created an incentive to prolong the case, but in fact, there is no indication on this record, he says, that the DA is interested in delaying anything. Indeed, he says, the record is quite to the contrary. Before the relationship came to light, the state requested that the trial begin less than 6 months after the indictment. Again, nothing to suggest that her official conduct was problematic or that she was motivated in some way that had an impact upon prejudice the defendant in some way. This relationship, the financial goings back and forth, those things did not have an impact upon the prosecution itself. And so the judge finds, without sufficient evidence, that the DA acquired a personal stake in the prosecution or that her financial arrangements had any impact on the case, the defendant's claims of an actual conflict must be denied. And he gets it right. As we often said, there is no indication of an actual conflict of interest here. But he goes on to say this, and this opens up the second portion, which is very critical of Fani Willis and what she has done here. The finding is by no means an indication that the court condones, as he describes this much in the media in the past 24 hours. He describes it as a tremendous lapse in judgment or the unprofessional manner of the district attorney's testimony during the evidentiary hearing. He's sitting right there looking at her, and he concludes that her testimony, the nature of it, the manner of her description, the manner of her testimony, her demeanor on the stand was unprofessional as a prosecutor held to these much higher standards. Rather, it is this court's opinion that Georgia law does not permit the finding of an actual conflict for simply making bad choices. Indeed, that's what the law is in Georgia and other places. Even if those bad choices are repeated, he says, And it's the trial court's duty to confine itself to relevant issues and applicable law properly brought before it. He says there are other forums that may also discuss this and address it. The General Assembly, the Ethics Commission, the State Bar of Georgia, the Fulton County Board of Commissioners, the voters of Fulton County, all sorts of other remedies out there. Then they may. He actually invites sort of their review of what's going on here. Doesn't necessitate her being removed because there's no actual conflict of interest, but says that that doesn't end the inquiry. And this is where it gets very critical of her. And this is the reason why it's been a bad week for Fani Willis. Says that the appellate courts have endorsed the application of an appearance of impropriety standard to state prosecutors, even without any explicit finding of an actual conflict. The appearance of impropriety is generally considered conduct or status, he says, that would lead a reasonable person to think that the actor is behaving or will be inclined to behave inappropriately or wrongfully. The appearance standard, the judge goes on to say, recognizes that even when no actual conflict exists, a perceived conflict in the reasonable eyes of the public, and that's what Judge McAfee is focusing on now. How does the public look at all of this? A conflict, a perceived conflict in the reasonable eyes of the public threatens confidence in the legal system itself. That confidence is what Judge McAfee is concerned about. When this danger goes uncorrected, it undermines the legitimacy and moral force of our already weakest branch of government. Yes, that's identified as the judiciary. Question in these days whether the judiciary is the weakest branch, but nonetheless, that is often the mantra, the description given the judiciary in our nation. One final observation, he said, can be gleaned from the appellate review of these standards. The remedy can vary. The remedy can vary, and he identifies that early on because he wants to open up the door to alternatives that he has, short of dismissal, short of throwing Fani Willis in the DA's office off the case. And indeed, he just does just that. He says, unlike an actual conflict, the finding of an appearance of impropriety does not automatically demand disqualification, nor would the finding of an appearance of impropriety on the part of the DA herself, in contrast to an actual conflict, necessarily result in the disqualification of the entire office. And so he announces, as he gets into this issue of appearance of impropriety, that this matter, serious, problematic, and yes, a huge problem, the HR problem, this personnel problem inside the office, which he takes note of and condemns and criticizes and expresses his own form of judicial disappointment about, nonetheless doesn't require complete disqualification. In the end, he says, with these principles in mind, the court finds that the record made at the evidentiary hearing established that the DA's prosecution is encumbered by an appearance of impropriety. That is not good news for Fani Willis. Plainly, she does not agree with that, nor did she feel that was the conclusion based upon her testimony. When we come back, I'm going to tell you more about what the judge had to say about her testimony, finding it unprofessional, and specifically what she needs to do to clean this up, or somebody needs to do to clean up the internal matter that he has now identified in this order.
Are you telling me the things you're gonna do for me? Yeah, I ain't blind and I don't.
We are back. All about this major decision coming out of the trial court in Fulton County, authored by the judge. His name is Scott McAfee. Going through that in some microscopic detail, microscopic justice this morning, understanding what he said and what he did not say that resulted in this decision by Nathan Wade, the special assistant district attorney, the lead prosecutor in that case yesterday afternoon, to resign, no longer a part of the case. One of the alternatives given by the judge to Fani Willis, either she's got to go, the DA's office has got to go generally, or he has got to go, and he chooses to leave as a result of this order. The court going through in great detail this decision to find that there is no conflict of interest. That's right. There isn't. We knew that from the start. That was very, very clear. But finding nonetheless that under Georgia law, the appearance of impropriety can compromise the course of justice and can affect the public's perception. And as a result of that, determining, as he did, that the record at the evidentiary hearing, that the DA's prosecution, all that she has done, including her own testimony, is encumbered by exactly that, an appearance of impropriety. And that's what animates him to do exactly what he did. Very important language. And again, he is delving into the HR problems, the personnel issues, which should have been taken care of a long time ago, and effectively cleaning this up, if you will, from the bench. Matters that should have been taken care of inside the DA's office, which are problematic, undeniably, as we have always said. He says this appearance is not created by mere status alone, but comes because of specific conduct and impacts more than a mere nebulous public interest because it concerns a public prosecutor. That is his notion, once again, doing this work on behalf of the people. The people have a right to have confidence in what's going on. And if that is compromised in some way, the judge, the prosecutor, everybody involved has an interest in ensuring that the public has confidence in that process. And here is some of the most important language that I identified when I read this order because of my own involvement in supervising situations inside offices where there are romantic relationships or ties between prosecutors. One of the most fundamental things, it can happen, and it does in fact take place all the time inside of offices, including prosecution offices. But one of the fundamental HR principles is that if indeed one of those people in the relationship is a supervisor, he or she plainly cannot supervise, that is, review the conduct, review the professional behavior, the accomplishments of the very person with whom they have a romantic relationship. That applies, of course, not just in prosecution offices. That applies across the board in private and public offices. If you are a supervisor, you should not be supervising someone with whom you have a relationship, a partnership in your personal life. And so the judge basically says just that. He says, even if the romantic relationship began after Wade's initial contract in November 2021, and again, an awful lot of information in this order, spends a lot of time talking about the timing of when this relationship began, determines in the end that nobody can be quite clear about when it is. The testimonial evidence is not clear on when it began. Basically says in the end it's not really relevant. I don't care, he says, so much about when this started. What he does say is the district attorney chose to continue supervising and paying Wade while maintaining such a relationship. That is a personnel criticism. That's a personnel condemnation of his about how she is handling her own office. She further allowed the regular and loose exchange of money between them without any exact or verifiable measure of reconciliation. Again, the kind of thing that an HR director or maybe another supervisor in the office would address. This lack of confirmed financial split creates the possibility and appearance that the district attorney benefited, albeit non-materially, from a contract whose award lay solely within her purview and policing. And then goes on to say this. Most importantly, were the case allowed to proceed unchanged, the concerns raised by the defendants would persist. As the DA herself testified, her relationship with Wade has only cemented after these motions and is stronger than ever. And then goes on to describe Wade. He says, Wade's patently unpersuasive explanation for the inaccurate interrogatories, that's a discussion about the discovery, the answers he provided earlier, he submitted in his pending divorce matter, indicates a willingness on his part to wrongfully conceal his relationship with the DA. As the case moves forward, the judge says, reasonable members of the public could easily be left to wonder whether the financial exchanges have continued, resulting in some form of benefit to the DA, or even when the romantic relationship has resumed. Put differently, an outsider could reasonably think that the DA is not exercising her independent professional judgment totally free of compromising influences. As long as Wade remains on the case, this unnecessary perception will persist. That's the language. That's the language right there that prompts Nathan Wade yesterday to resign. And indeed, he does exactly that. The court goes on to say it doesn't place a lot of credence in testimony. Remember this testimony of this fellow named Terrence Bradley, comments generally about how the evidentiary presentation by the defense, by the prosecution, was not clear. But in the end, he says it has an odor of mendacity meaning untruthfulness, People may have been lying during the course of this proceeding. The court is not under an obligation, the judge says, to address every single instance of potential dishonesty, but reasonable questions about the DA and her hand-selected assistant DA testifying untruthfully about the timing of the relationship further underpin the finding of an appearance of impropriety and the need to make proportional efforts to cure it. He's referencing once again the fact that he's got alternatives here. Doesn't need to throw everything out. He's got proportional efforts to cure it, and indeed does just that. He also addresses forensic misconduct, identifies along the way a speech that Fani Willis gave on January 14th of 2024. He said in these public and televised comments, the district attorney complained that a Fulton County commissioner and so many others questioned her decision, and describes there the danger of public comment by a prosecuting attorney. By including a reference, he says, to others on the heels of this motion, the DA left open the question for the public to consider, and the court finds, after considering all of that, the speech that did include defendant Roman and his counsel within its ambit, whether intentional or not, was also improper. At best, it can divine, under the sole direction of the authority in the state of Georgia, that the court cannot find the speech cross the line to the point where the defendants have been denied the opportunity for a fundamentally fair trial, or that it requires the disqualification of the DA. In other words, I find this problematic. I don't like what the DA has said publicly in the context of her official capacity, but it doesn't cross the line, doesn't deprive the defendants, including Roman, including Donald Trump, of his right to a fair trial. But it was legally improper. That's the judge coming to that conclusion. That public comment, he says, creates dangerous waters for the DA to wade further into. And then gives this admonition. He said, the time may well have arrived for an order preventing the state from mentioning the case in any public forum to prevent prejudicial pretrial publicity, but that is not the motion before the court. I'm not doing that today. That could come down the road. Again, proposing perhaps a gag order on the state if that continues. He's not doing that today. In the end, he says, whether this case ends in convictions, acquittals, or something in between, the result should be one that instills confidence in the process. A reasonable observer, he says, unburdened by partisan blinders, should believe that the law was impartially applied, that those accused of crimes had a fair opportunity to present their defenses, and that any verdict was based on our criminal defense system's best efforts at ascertaining the truth. The evidence of appearance of impropriety remains and must be handled even as this matter goes forward. All of that from the pen of Judge Scott McAfee, issued just yesterday, changing once again somewhat the We are back talking this morning about these cases, these trials brought against Donald Trump, a president candidate for the presidency of the United States of America, and talking in great detail. Some microscopic justice this morning, reviewing, analyzing this major decision by Scott McAfee, the judge in the Georgia case, finding no reason to disqualify, no actual conflict of interest warranting the removal of Fani Willis or her office, but finding that the appearance of impropriety is sufficient to prompt something to happen here, and that is, as we saw yesterday, the decision by Nathan Wade, this principal lead prosecutor, to resign in the interest of justice, in the interest of rule of law, and to follow up on all of the things that the judge said in his order. A significant ruling, again, doesn't impact, as does the decision earlier in the week by him to dismiss some charges, doesn't impact the content, the substance of the prosecution, but certainly affects what is a significant issue in and of its own right, which is the status, the integrity of the prosecutor herself in this case. And Fani Willis not only needs to address now these dismissed charges that are out there, but also needs now to address and find a way forward to ensure that the professionalism that the judge has identified is missing from this case, at least in this aspect of it, needs to be restored. And that is the task in front of her. That is the task in front generally of her office as this case goes forward. Take some inventory. Is there a trial date in this? No, there isn't. Is there a trial date right now in the New York case we discussed earlier in this broadcast? The answer is no. Is there a trial in the Mar-a-Lago case, a trial date set in the Mar-a-Lago case? Similarly, we're going to chat about that in just a few moments. No. Is there a trial date set in this principal election interference case pending in the federal district court in the District of Columbia? The answer there is no as well. Why? Because there, the Supreme Court, again, addressing this issue of immunity and legitimacy of some of the charges against Donald Trump. Right now, on this morning, Saturday, March 16th, with respect to all of these 4 criminal cases, the state cases, the criminal cases, no trial dates, increasingly likely, not certain that any one of them will be tried before the election in November. And that is a matter, of course, for attention, not only by voters, but also concern by anyone who's concerned about the movement forward of cases like this, the criminal justice system generally, and as Judge Scott McAfee said, the integrity of the system, the perception of the court system by the public, all important in America. As always, we appreciate your phone calls, your comments, your questions at 844-967-2789. A lot covered already this morning. Looking forward to more of that in the remaining time of this broadcast. Delighted to have some callers calling in with their comments or questions. Let's begin with David. David in Mequon, appreciate your being part of our program this morning.
Thank you, James, for taking my call this morning. I'm not sure. Are you familiar with a gentleman named Victor Davis Hanson by chance?
I don't know that I am. Tell me about him.
Okay. All right. Well, he's with the Hoover Institute, and he's a conservative, but an intellectual conservative. Mm-hmm. And he actually is discussing the same thing that you did this morning, actually on X. And he talks about it, and he just said, he headlines on X, he goes, "No law left in America from Willis to her." So he kind of lays out the case, basically saying that what would it take for her to get a prosecutor disqualified, because she lied under oath. You have three, not just 2 witnesses contradict her sworn testimony. Have 30 or 40 more telephone pings belly her testimony of her whereabouts. Have, say, emails in addition to the current text of an associate contradicting almost everything she said. In other words, McAfee nullified the evidence before him. McAfee, sorry. Nullified the evidence before him and removed the less culpable of the 2 guilty parties, given all these illegalities originated with Willis herself. Is there still a law against perjury and fraud, or does ideology and race now determine guilt or innocence in America?
Right. And David, appreciate very much the comment. Obviously, this is what we do in America, right? We talk about the merits of cases. I would commend to you and all the listeners, including Victor David Hanson, as he plainly has done, a review of the courts wrestling with this. And that's why we have judges who are human beings, right? All of us, if we were judges, may have different perspectives, may approach this differently. And this judge says, you know what, I'm highly troubled by what I see. I'm troubled by the evidence that is presented before me. And although he says in the end, I can't make heads or tails about all this conflicting evidence, he does not find perjury. He doesn't find that people overtly lied. He said it's got this air of mendacity. Something about it doesn't sound just right. But in the end, he says, all of this leads me to believe that there is no reason to get rid of the prosecutor, but you've got this major problem. And again, I think that your comment and that of Victor David Hanson reflects the notion that we should all be looking at this opinion. We don't necessarily have to agree with it, but we have a system where we have judges and we call upon them to make not just judgment calls, but apply the facts to the law and come to the very best judgment that they possibly can. That's what Judge McAfee did here. Appreciate very much the comment, David, and the observation. First Amendment America, we all talk about these things as we do on this radio broadcast, and I thank you very much for your view on that as well, David. Mark is also calling in this morning. Mark, your comment or question about all the things we're talking about this morning.
Yeah, it's tough to nail down just one particular thing on the case in New York, where the evidence was not forthcoming when it should have been forthcoming. A suspicious part of me in my old auditor's brain wonder if somebody in the Trump contact sphere that said, well, hold on to this stuff and we'll use this as a tool to delay again. And in the case down in Fulton County, where yes, it was a bad decision there. I don't know whether she lied or not, or her knowledge of the chain of events, in the relationship. How many times the phone calls were pinged? Because if you might be within a mile of somebody and not be in contact with those, your phones are still in the same place. They're within a mile of each other. And that's no clear indication to me that they're actually in contact with each other on the phone at that particular time. But the point is that Michael Roman and his fellow co-defendants in this case committed a nationwide conspiracy to deprive me and my fellow citizens of our electoral rights guaranteed under the 14th Amendment in Section 2. In furtherance, as I've stated before, this is all part of a vast conspiracy to overturn the last election. And you just can't get away from that. And Josh Call should actually pick up the exact case that Fani Willis has with the documentation she's developed down in Georgia, and pick it up here in the state of Wisconsin, because as we heard Andrew Hitt say, he claimed on 60 Minutes, well, I felt threatened and all this. But now taped evidence has come out. I don't know if it was videotape or audio tape of them at that meeting after they signed the fake electorals documents back in December of 2020, that they're high-fiving and cheering and applauding each other for their conspiracy against the people of the state of Wisconsin.
Sure. And Mark, lots and lots of things to unpack there as you are doing. Let me just pick one of those and say that, yes, indeed, some people describe the entire Fani Willis matter as a sideshow. It isn't just that, right? It does go, as the judge said, to the integrity of the process there. It is a pretrial motion, which, again, defendants have a right to bring forward. But to your very good point, which I agree with entirely, it doesn't change the landscape of this case. And the principal allegations in that RICO indictment, that sweeping indictment, are, much as it is in the federal case, the interference case as well, an attempt, Mark, as you just said, to not only undermine our election, to steal the votes, to affect the results of the 2020 election, and to do it in a way that's in violation of Georgia law and in New York law and arguably federal law as well when that case goes to trial. That's the big picture issue, right? And one of the concerns about the present status of all these cases is that we may not get resolution on any of them, including these interference cases, until after this election. An awful lot of people in America looking for some ultimate decision by a jury of peers, determining beyond what a grand jury has already determined that there is indeed evidence to support a finding beyond a reasonable doubt of a conviction or not. Increasingly less likely that any of these cases will go to trial before we all go into the voting booths in August and November and go ahead and attempt to resolve all of this in the electoral process as well. We've got other callers calling in. Appreciate that very much as well. Kristen from Waukesha. Kristen, thanks for being with me this morning. How are you today? We've got Kristen on the line. Yes. Is Kristen there? Is she? Okay. Well, Kristen, I think, is on the line. Yes. Kristen?
Okay.
Okay.
Now
Very good. I can hear you now. Great. Thank you so much.
Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Kristen.
I just can't get over the strange misogyny of this case. I mean, essentially, you've got two people, one of whom is a supervisor, having a relationship.
Right.
That, to me, that's the issue. That's the problem.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of different things where she could be not supervising his work correctly because she's in love with him. I get it. But for them to break this down as a monetary thing is what kills me. She is a independent woman making a great salary and an important job, and they think she's in this for the money.
Right.
And they're scrutinizing, did he buy you flowers once? Did he ever buy you lunch? I mean, it's just so stupid. That's the part that really gets me.
Right.
I agree that the appearance of impropriety is the issue. They should have, put this relationship on the back burner until this case was over. I get it. They fell in love. They couldn't help themselves, whatever. But it's the making it about money thing that just kills me.
And
she did not need his money.
She didn't.
She's not in this for the money.
Right. And the judge specifically finds just that. He says, this is her salary. It's $200,000 per year. This relationship was not a motivating factor in any way. This is on page 8 of the opinion. Makes it very clear. He says general motive for it can never be disregarded. But that's not here. And there's no showing, no demonstration that this conduct in any way was motivated by financial interests. And I think you're right, Kristen. That's exactly what the focus of this has been all along from the start, as we have discussed before. This notion that somehow there's this financial connection leads to a conflict of interest has always not just been attenuated, but almost non-existent. So my perspective is just as yours, that the basic force of the motion, the arguments being made by Roman's attorney and others, just didn't have a there, right? And the judge basically says that, and then goes on, as you and I have just spoken, and as we reported this morning, to find that while all this does not result in disqualification, these other issues, it shouldn't have happened. But it is a personnel matter. It is internal, as I've said, and the supervision issue is a concern, as you've also underscored. And so, Kristen, thank you very much for your comment this morning. Always insightful as we think and go forward then with yet another case. We were in New York, in Georgia most recently here, and now we're going to Florida. We're going to go a little bit further south, not too much further south, into Florida and talk about the Mar-a-Lago documents case. Yes, indeed, that's still pending, and as I said before in the inventory, no clear trial date on that matter either. Donald Trump among several defendants there, not only for improperly, illegally taking, acquiring, keeping documents in the course of his departure from the presidency, keeping those in Mar-a-Lago, arguably New Jersey as well. And the Supreme Court, there, of course, not weighing in on that case, weighing in on the other case involving election interference in the District of Columbia. What is going on there is, of course, like the other cases, is pretrial motions. And there again, Judge Eileen Cannon, they're entertaining various pretrial motions from Donald Trump. The focus of those, again, is premised upon allegations that, number one, the special counsel had no authority to do what he's doing, that the Attorney General's position in support of his appointment was invalid, that Donald Trump himself is immune from prosecution, the same issue that is before the Supreme Court right now. And also these are personal records, and therefore the statute doesn't apply to him. Indeed, just on Thursday of this week, another major decision coming out of Eileen Cannon, shutting down one of Donald Trump's efforts to derail that documents case, overseeing this case, rejecting one of those principal motions to have the case dismissed. And this is the first time she's denied a legal attack on the indictment. And when we come back, we're going to talk more about exactly what that's all about and more. Stay with us. We are back talking about yet another case. This is the Mar-a-Lago case. This is the documents case pending in the district court in Florida. Eileen Cannon just this week shutting down one of Donald Trump's pretrial motions, attacking that case, asking that it be dismissed, the classified documents and presidential documents case. She basically says in a 2-page order, rebuffing arguments by Donald Trump and his lawyers, that the central statute in the indictment, so-called the Espionage Act, was impermissibly vague and should be struck down entirely. Struck down, therefore, the entire indictment needs to go away. She dismisses that, does this following a nearly day-long hearing in Fort Pierce, Florida, where she entertained arguments about all of this. The government, of course, says that the former president in this case violated the law 32 times by removing these large numbers of highly sensitive documents from the White House after he left office. In her order, Judge Cannon acknowledges that Trump's lawyers have raised various arguments warranting serious consideration, but adds that their concerns about the Espionage Act were better made in connection with jury instruction briefing, dismissing that notion right now, arguably opening up the door down the road for this to be returned to her attention down the road. along the way, dismissing basically this notion that somehow Donald Trump had a personal right to these documents. These were his personal documents, as opposed to what we know they actually are, which are documents owned by who? By the people of the United States of America, by our government. That's what the Espionage Act and the other cases indicate in this particular prosecution. Other matters related to selective prosecution, this immunity issue and authority issue, all those other things still pending in front of her, presumably for future disposition, future argument in front of Judge Eileen Cannon. But this past week, saying as to Donald Trump's claim that the Espionage Act is invalid and that the counts under that act should be therefore dismissed, the case should go away, rejecting that notion and handing him the first time that she's denied a legal attack on the indictment in that case. One other matter going back to Washington, D.C., I want to mention here, we're going to chat a whole lot more next broadcast about the Supreme Court. Notable that late yesterday afternoon, the Supreme Court in one of these major cases in the social media area that we've talked about in great length, a case called O'Connor-Radcliffe versus Garnier, issuing a major decision on rules for blocking citizens from officials' accounts. Amy Coney Barrett, writing for the court, said two things are required before officials may be sued by people they have blocked on their personal accounts. If those are pending on a personal platform, the officials must have been empowered to speak for the government on the issues they addressed on their sites, and they must have used that authority in the posts in question. A major case. We're going to spend some time next time chatting all about that and describing in greater detail what Justice Coney Barrett has said. The case, again, is not only O'Connor-Radcliffe versus Garnier, but also Linkey versus Freed, a part of some larger cases that are pending in this area of social media generally that we have talked about before. The court, of course, did not apply this new standard to the cases before it, but instead sent them back to Michigan and California for the courts to apply this new standard in determining whether or not the people who were complaining about the officials who blocked them on personal accounts, those complaints based upon the First Amendment, saying that, gee, if the official has this personal account providing information, providing official government authority, statements, other information in the public domain, and I'm blocked from that, that is a violation of the First Amendment. The court not dispositively ruling on those decisions, but saying here's the standard by which you need to address those, lower court, and determining whether or not the actors, that is the government actors here, in not only setting up their personal accounts, doing what they do on those personal accounts, posting things about their own involvement and the matters that are in the scope of government domain, whether that's state action sufficient to make the First Amendment claims legitimate. So those cases, again, coming out yesterday, an awful lot more coming out down the road, including other matters having to do with social media, the interaction between states and social media providers, and indeed the executive branch in an attempt to influence and have an impact upon what is appearing on those social media platforms. In our final minutes today, I want to talk about a major programming note, and that is that next week, as we always are, we're going to be coming to you again through the broadcast stations of Civic Media. But our broadcast is going to sound and appear to you a little bit different. First of all, we're changing the name. The name of our broadcast beginning next Saturday, the 24th, is going to be Amicus, a law review with Jim Santel. Amicus, a law review. I'm going to tell you more about the name of our new program, but I'll also reaffirm that in fundamental ways, the content, the substance of our program is not going to change. As always, going to focus upon what happened, some of the major exposition of the stories in law and government, delivery of justice. We'll explain the reasons why these things have happened. We're going to go into those things in detail as we did today. We're going to examine the practical trappings, as we have always done, specific aspects of government action. And we're going to provide some instruction, maybe some perspectives on the intersection of the law with civic responsibility and engagement in the community. As always, we're going to do things like undiscovered justice, things that are not in the main public broadcast areas. The mainstream media may have overlooked some of this. We're going to talk about rule of law snapshots, brief issues that are in the news in the area of justice for you to know about. We're going to talk about microscopic justice. That's the kinds of things we did today in understanding in depth the things that are important to our understanding of the law. And we're also going to talk about something called law review case notes, a little bit more of my opinions on some of the things that are going on, the issues that we describe. Again, we're going to be restyling our broadcast a bit under the name Amicus, a law review. I'm going to be here. It's still going to be 9 to 11, 2 hours every Saturday morning. Always going to encourage your phone calls at 844-967-2789. The music is going to be a bit different. The intro is going to be a bit different. So when you tune in next Saturday at 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, anticipate that will happen. But I'm still going to be here. My wonderful producer, Johnny, is still going to be here as well as we pursue with you all of these issues related to civics, civic responsibility, law, government, and the delivery of justice, the delivery of rule of law in these United States of America. Come back and join us for Amicus, a law review with Jim Santel next week, beginning here on the broadcast stations of Civic Media. Thank you for being with me today, and have a good week, everybody.